From the archives of the Great Library of Arathes, Golden City of Elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 48.
There's no escape, Neversleep.
Dandrican's gloating voice came from somewhere overhead. Fraenk and Kyla scrambled back away from the monster. They both looked up to see the small man floating in the air towards them, nearly 50 feet up and just out of Frank's accuracy range for a thrown blade. He was wearing some kind of belt made of clouds, which was apparently the reason he could now fly, or at least hover. Fraenk now recalled the same belt Dandrican had on in the shop when he had first come for the Mind Thief's appraisal. Apparently this was the power it held, giving the wearer a cloud-like lift. Another ill-gotten magical item he'd either scammed or pilfered, Fraenk had no doubt. But Dandrican looked wholly novice at its operation. He pinioned his arms forward, then back, trying to keep his balance. Then he twisted in a series of jerks to maneuver himself around to face them. Dandrican gave them a fierce scowl, obviously intending for this moment to be terrifying, or at least serious. But Fraenk and Kyla burst out laughing. "You should have practiced more with that. You look ridiculous," Fraenk shouted at him.
You don't know when to quit, do you, Fraenk? The city is mine now. Even after I'm done with this loyal creature, I possess the Mind Thief, and I can enslave everyone in Arathes, including you.
"No one's gonna like you if you force them to be your friend, Dandrican," Fraenk retorted.
Perhaps I'll keep you around so we can discuss how to properly run a true authoritarian government. Krieg was just the first, but there are many of us in League across the world who are ready to seize power.
"You think I want to be alive just to hear you talk politics? No thanks." Fraenk scoffed.
Have it your way.
The black-hearted dealer of the accursed shrugged. They watched as the behemoth rose back to its full height, then delivered a huge overhand smash to the adjacent warehouse. It would soon be doing that to every building in the city, and they had no way to stop it. Dandrican cackled from his floating vantage.
I think we'll go take a tour of Blackroot Estate first. I'll give your lady elf my regards.
Dandrican sneered. The creature turned to look at them for a brief moment, then waved its clawed fingers at them in an obscene mockery of a boyish goodbye. Then it stomped off in the other direction, towards Blackroot District and the rest of the city.
You couldn't just pretend, then cut his throat later?
Kyla asked. He was going to destroy the city and kill everyone regardless. You can't ask me to tickle him with a feather in the meantime, Fraenk said.
Fair. Also, what is wrong with you?
They watched the monster lumber down the row, smashing and destroying indiscriminately. Fraenk could hear Lady Blackroot's voice lecturing him how each warehouse and building was a valuable asset for not just the clients who had property stored, but the district as a whole. And every destroyed building was a weakening of Blackroot itself, from which they might never recover. But all he could think about was his own failure to see Dandrican as capable of creating such chaos. Fraenk knew he was unscrupulous and conniving, but this plan was more grandiose than he'd ever given the man credit for. Perhaps it was that mix of ambition and willingness to attempt something truly this ridiculous and risky. But by the powers, Fraenk had to grudgingly admit the fortunes were favouring his recklessness. Fraenk watched as the creature smashed through the storehouse on the row where hundreds of barrels of ale and packed crates of liquor bottles were waiting to be hauled off to the many inns and taverns across the city. A moment later it erupted into a bright plume of fire that rolled into the sky. Fraenk balled his fists in anger. This had gone too far. The unforgivable crime of destruction of booze aside, Fraenk knew he couldn't just watch this thing rampage. It could kill tens or hundreds of thousands of souls, starting with the other woman he had sworn to protect, Lady Arathes. Without Brimblade or some other wizard, they had no way to properly fight this thing. Then an idea flashed like the sweep of the beam from a lighthouse. "Valthor the ex-wizard!" Fraenk said excitedly. If we can get to him—
No, Frank.
Kyla cut him off.
He left.
What?
After he took me to the temple and said he was leaving Arathis for a season. Said he had to atone for some things. He's not here.
That's damn inconvenient, Fraenk grumbled, turning. Maybe he's built some kind of flame weapon for destroying rampaging monsters. Behind them, he saw the massive dry docks where the Pelusian galleon had been for months. Fraenk recalled how Fenduin Talofrond, the Acheron of harbours, complained in nearly every one of their meetings about the work stoppage on the ship due to a lack of payment. Despite many letters and sending personal couriers to the capital, Cyrosol, they were unable to find neither someone to bring their account current, nor even anyone who was responsible for sending the ship in for repairs in the first place. How could an empire be so poorly managed and disorganized that they'd lose an entire war galleon and no one cared? Fraenk was sure that eventually some enterprising soul would uncover a parchment and follow the clues to the missing ship. Who knows if Pyleus would even be a kingdom by then? Then an idea began to form. Dandrican doesn't know the ex-wizard isn't here, though, Fraenk said. Lead the creature away to the lighthouse. It's protected by warding spells. Hold up there until Nim brings the arcane lords. Kyla's brow creased.
We'd have to run all the way to the end of the jetty, where we'd be trapped and hope that the old coot's spells can stop an arcane nether-demon?
She looked at Fraenk as if he was the one now mad. No, not us, Fraenk said. I'll go. You get out of here. Like you said, it's my district and my job to protect it. I can't let all these people die.
That's very admirable, and I wish you the best of luck. We'll build a small, flat memorial statue in your honour.
Kyla met his eyes, her face grave. Then a smile curled at the corner of her mouth.
So let's go do the worst idea you've ever come up with in the short time I've known you, which is sure to fail, she said. Just how exactly are you going to get that thing to follow us?
Just watch, Fraenk said. He could see Dandrican hovering behind the monster in a trail of wispy clouds. Dandrican, you pathetic little whelp. You're going to fail at this just like everything else in your life. You couldn't make it as a wizard. Your parents shipped you off because they didn't love you. And I hear your older brother is far more handsome. Fraenk wasn't sure if his taunts were getting through to Dandrican at first. But the moment he had mentioned his older brother, both the man and the enormous monster halted. Oh, so that wasn't a lie. Your brother is your better. Dexter, was it? Shall we send for him to make sure your plan succeeds? The words had no sooner escaped his lips when the Leviathan turned completely around. They saw its many terrible eyes flare brightly before it began towards them. Not a slow plodding pace, but a ground-shuddering run. That worked a little too well. Fraenk gulped. It was Kyla's turn to grab his arm and pull him, sprinting toward the building behind them. Any hopes that they could outpace this beast in the open was shattered, like the warehouses it was now ploughing through indiscriminately. They slipped inside the cavernous dry dock building and were immediately looking at another massive behemoth. This one was made of wood, rope, nails, and sails. It was the Pyleosian galleon, called the Maerx's Gambit, actually larger by half than Dandrican's monster, and was currently under maintenance in the building. The ship was set up in a long, wide trench that could be flooded to float the ship in and out. Currently the water was out, and the boat appeared to be set into the floor, with its main deck level with the dock's flooring. Getting closer, one could see it was actually resting on massive blocks and fringed by an array of scaffolding that gave workers access to any part of its exterior. There was an elaborate yoke and pulley system rigged up to lift the vessel onto the blocks, just so they could service the parts of the ship that were below the waterline. It was truly a mind-boggling feat of dwarven engineering, no doubt. Who else would be mad enough to build such a thing? The scale of both the building and the ship made Fraenk feel minuscule.
It's too fast. We're not going to make it.
Kyla said what Fraenk was already thinking. What do you suggest?
Maybe the ship has bolt throwers or some other mounted weapons,
she replied. Fraenk didn't have the heart to tell her that all the armaments were removed during maintenance, There was a slight chance that something wasn't removed yet. "Worth a look," Fraenk said, hoping to at least get her away from the path of the monster. Kyla didn't wait for another word on the matter. She ran straight for one of the scaffolding and scaled it, climbing the braces, then vaulting up the side of the massive ship. Much in the same way she'd done with the wall when they were escaping the Blackhounds. This time, however, Fraenk found himself grateful she was out of immediate danger. A moment later, she appeared back at the rails.
"There's no weapons, Fraenk, but I think there's something we can use,"
Kyla shouted excitedly.
"Get up here! Hurry!"
He couldn't imagine what she might have discovered there, but he was willing to try anything at this point. Fraenk eyed the scaffolding on the ship. Although she made the ascent look painfully easy, Fraenk realized his own ascent would be much more challenging. And adding to it, his body was starting to ache miserably from the continuous abuse it had endured. He tried unsuccessfully to find a part of himself that wasn't sore. "Go on, I'll be right there." But just as he stepped forward, the side of the building exploded inward in a shower of flying wood. Fraenk was thrown forward, tumbling bodily into the support scaffolding, which collapsed a moment later. He dropped down through 2 more levels of boards into the deep trench where the boat was positioned. The planks tipped him forward, and he rolled, coming to a stop halfway under the galleon in a shower of debris and dust. He found himself coughing and staring up at a keel that was wider than his arms splayed out to both sides, which they happened to be. Frank's head hurt, and his vision didn't seem to want to form one single image, but was 2 slightly offset pictures that moved past one another. As his eyes came back into focus, Fraenk noticed something in the hull of the ship. Thin, beautiful lines that moved and shimmered, running along the length of the wood. It brought to mind the other complaint that the Master of Docks had been bitterly lamenting. These large, important vessels were reinforced with warding spells and other seals of protection, which kept them seaworthy in a naval action against enemy spellcasters. Without them, the ships were vulnerable to any number of hazards, but it also made them notoriously difficult to repair. All the spell work would have to be unwoven before boards could be replaced. Then the wards added back again. It was as time-consuming as it was expensive. The wards were still on this ship. The creature could smash through regular buildings, but could it get through a structure that was magically reinforced? There was one way to find out.
"Fraenk! Where'd you scurry off to? We're not done with you."
Dandrican screeched as he floated through the new opening in the dock. The creature unleashed a deafening roar that rattled the very foundations of the building. Brilliant flares of colourful glowing tracery blossomed out from the hull as the ward spells seemed to deflect even the waves of air from the monster. Fraenk got unsteadily to his feet. He could see where the scaffolding had collapsed along the side of the ship in both directions. There were metal rungs to climb out of the long flood trench, but that would just put him up on the floor in front of the monster. He had to get onto the ship, but on this side at least there was no way to do that. But first he had to make sure Kyla got to safety. He ran out into the open area between the ship and the dock. "Kyla!" he shouted up.
"I'm kinda busy, Fraenk,"
she shouted back. "Get below deck! The ship has wards! You should be safe!"
"Oh, no you don't!"
Dandrican was hovering up near the building's rafters and heard the exchange. A moment later, the monster's long tentacles were slamming down on the deck of the ship. Fraenk watched helplessly as the behemoth battered the deck of the ship. As it did, powerful, jagging arcs rippled through the wards like bolts of rainbow lightning and giving off angry, crackling protests. The galleon itself seemed no worse for wear. Fraenk knew the spells would wear out from repeated abuse, but at least for a while Kyla would be safe inside, assuming she survived the initial attack. "Kyla, are you all right?" Fraenk shouted up to her. There was no reply. Only the face of Bultzone the Destroyer looking down at him with its many terrible eyes.
"What are you doing down there, Fraenk?"
Dandrican grinned wickedly.
"You're trapped! If you're not careful, you could get squished."
The beast's arm shot downward towards him. Fraenk had to dive backwards to narrowly avoid the fate of Brimblade. He had no time to recover, however, because the creature was furiously sliding its clawed hand toward him, trying to grab, smash, or slice his body. whichever it could manage to end his life. An enormous barb dug into the stone floor right between Frank's legs. "Not like that," Fraenk wheezed. The beast tried to grab him again, but was at the full extension of its arm. The massive appendage pulled back out of the trench as quickly as it had entered. A stupid part of his mind wanted to believe it was over, that the Leviathan had deemed Fraenk to be out of reach and therefore worth no further effort, but of course he was wrong. A moment later, the beast's flailing tentacles came spilling down like two massive, enraged black snakes. They whipped and probed blindly, searching for their quarry. Fraenk ducked behind the only hiding place available to him, one of the dozen massive blocks that were supporting the entire weight of the galleon. The dark appendage appeared to his left, sweeping the ground for someone to latch onto and crush. The moment it bumped into the block, Fraenk had just enough time to roll under it as the tentacle coiled whip-like around it. There was a deep, splintering groan, and the support block was suddenly ripped out from under the galleon. Another shuddering series of creaks ran through the length of the ship. Then the building's support timbers. He looked up, holding his breath, hoping the massive weight of the galleon above him would hold. In a way, it felt like this moment encapsulated his entire life. Standing at the bottom, the solid weight of everything above waiting to crush him, while monstrous snakes came at him from all sides, also trying to get him. And yet, somehow he stood. Through it all, and in spite of everything, there he was. He had no idea how, and would certainly not go as far as to credit one of the many unseen forces that people seemed to beg when they needed help, blame when things went wrong and otherwise forget the remainder of the time. But there was certainly something unbelievable about everything he had been through. He made a quiet promise to himself that he would put to paper everything which had transpired. If nothing else, it may be useful for his eventual successor to review the details in order to better know and serve the district. This was contingent, of course, on Fraenk surviving the giant monster which was still trying to crush the life out of him. A moment later, the whipping tentacles were back, this time probing deeper for him. The monster had its head wedged between the galleon and the trench to allow further reach. Fraenk ran as the appendages snaked after him. He tried getting behind other support blocks, but the monster knocked them out of the way, and with each new one gone, the more of the galleon's immense weight was held by the overhead rigging. Then the whole boat began to move sideways, giving the creature more room to get further down, and its tentacles closer to grabbing Fraenk. Stealing a backwards glance, Fraenk saw the monster now had its full head into the channel, and all the support blocks were toppled. Worse still, the scaffolding on the opposite side had also collapsed. Fraenk had nowhere else to go and was running out of room to run. He backed away to the far side of the trench, trying to keep the ship between himself and the monster. But its probing appendages ran beneath the keel, searching hungrily for him. Then the creature lowered its head and looked sideways across at Fraenk. The many terrible yellow glowing eyes found him there in the darkness beneath the massive ship. And although he tried to look anywhere else, his gaze was compelled to stare back. The nether demon had him, and Fraenk saw in those eyes an ancient cruelty beyond madness, eons of despair and the end of... A rough coil of rope smacked him in the head from above. For a moment he was stunned like someone had slapped him. Then instinctively, like it was the most natural thing he had ever done, Fraenk grabbed hold of it and looked up. A beautiful figure in a radiant halo of light was looking down at him from high above. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, Fraenk mistook her for an actual Lynn Tyrion. But that was the malfunctioning of an overworked mind. Still, he found himself smiling in spite of it all. She laughed.
"Quit grinning like a low-country furbolg and hold on tight,"
Kyla shouted from atop one of the galleon's yard arms. She kicked a fat chunk of timber off the opposite side of the beam. Fraenk saw it was tied to the rope he was holding and ran up through a suspended pulley in the ceiling. "Wait, I'm not!" Fraenk had just enough time to register both of the black tentacles flashing toward him before the rope went taut, and he was jerked upward. Fraenk immediately lost his grip and everything twisted. An inverted world sped by him downward, and he realized he was the one upside down with the rope looped around his foot. He felt the blood thundering in his ears as he was pulled upwards by one ankle. Fraenk's head snapped back and he looked down to see two large, dark, worm-like shapes surging up, seeking to pull him apart. He heard something rush at him. Then, with a thump, his world went dark. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Grey Sage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.